evening. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Lung Life webinar, How is Your Lung Life? Tips on how to protect and love your lungs. My name is Jill Hubick. I'm a registered nurse and certified respiratory educator with Lung Saskatchewan. It is my pleasure to welcome you and to be your host and moderator tonight with the hopes of helping you live your best lung life. Before we begin the presentation, I would like to acknowledge that the land we're hosting this webinar on is on Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral and traditional territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux, as well as the territory of the Métis. Lung Saskatchewan affirms our commitment to reconciliation and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations, and we are very grateful we are able to host this event where we are. It's almost Valentine's Day, a time where we often think about our hearts and pay more attention to our love life compared to our lung life. But today we are going to celebrate the organ that works with our heart and breathes at least 22,000 times a day for us. We will also learn tips on how we can show our lungs some love. Prior to tonight's presentation, we reached out to you, our online communities of support, and our networks, and we asked you what you wanted to learn tonight. We felt it was important because this presentation is for you, and the purpose of this webinar series, Lung Life, is to help you live your best lung life. Thank you so much for those of you that completed our survey. We will do our best to answer your questions tonight. But if you didn't get a chance to answer the survey or you have additional questions, following Dr. Graham's presentation, we will still have time for a moderated question and answer period. So if you have questions for Dr. Graham, please type your questions into the question feature of the webinar software. You will find this feature on the top right-hand side of your screen. And if you'd like to watch this webinar again, or if you want to view any of the other previously recorded webinars, you can do so by tuning into our website, lungsask.ca. All right, it is now my pleasure to introduce to you our presenter. Dr. Brian Graham is currently a professor emeritus at the University of Saskatchewan in the Division of Respirology, Critical Care, and Sleep Medicine. He has dedicated his adult life to lung health. Dr. Graham was the CEO of Lung Saskatchewan for 32 years, and he is also a world-renowned researcher in the area of pulmonary function testing. He has been recognized around the world with many different awards for his outstanding dedication and contributions to lung health. Lung Saskatchewan is so proud to have him as the presenter tonight, as our colleague, and as a dear friend. Dr. Graham's presentation is the final webinar of the 2024 and 2025 Lung Life webinar series sponsored by GSK. And what a wonderful way to end this series. This educational webinar series was specifically created to empower those living with and caring for those with lung disease to live better. Together, GSK and Lung Saskatchewan have provided you a wide variety of presentations on various lung health topics. New with the support of GSK, Lung Saskatchewan now has a podcast called Let's Talk Lungs, providing you tips from lung health experts on how you can take your best breath. We hope you will tune into the show. Every episode is available to you on demand anytime on your podcast streaming services so you can listen wherever you're breathing life in. I'm pleased to welcome our friends now from GSK to bring greetings tonight ahead of the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Udo, and I'm an associate on the Patient Affairs and Advocacy team at GSK Canada. Our team is GSK's trusted partners, champions, and advocates of patients, caregivers, and patient organizations within GSK and the broader Canadian healthcare environment. By building synergistic relationships with patient organizations, we actively listen to patients and their caregivers to generate valuable insights. These insights are then systematically integrated into our decision making and activities across the product lifecycle, ensuring patient centricity remains at the heart of everything we do at GSK. We also champion the patient voice through our policy and advocacy efforts. The work we do enables us to improve patient experiences and outcomes in a multidimensional way. We are so thrilled and immensely proud to partner with LungSask for their 2024 Lung Life webinar series. This series has been designed to empower and educate individuals living with or caring for someone affected by lung disease, enabling them to live their best lung life. Throughout these webinars, you will receive innovative, relevant, accessible, sometimes entertaining, but certainly practical advice from leading lung health experts with topics chosen based on your feedback to ensure that they're relevant and that they truly support your lung health journey. Thank you all and have a great evening.
I'm here to talk to you about your lung life. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that my home in Saskatoon is on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. In the spirit of full disclosure, I'd like to acknowledge that the photo for my opening slide is one that I took in Saskatchewan on a mid-February afternoon some years ago. However, this presentation is being pre-recorded, and I'm currently in Costa Rica, and this is what a mid-February afternoon looks like here. If everything goes according to plan, I'll be able to join you remotely at the end of this presentation to answer your questions. The purpose of this presentation is to talk about lungs. Most folks have a general knowledge base about lungs. They know pretty much where the lungs are hanging in the chest, and they know that we can breathe in and breathe out with our lungs. But I would like to get into a bit more detail about how the lungs work and how they function. And by the end of this presentation, I hope that you will have a better understanding of all of the things that are going on in the lungs to make them work for you. And at least once or twice in the presentation, you'll say to yourself, that's interesting, I didn't really know that. And perhaps we'll also have a little bit of fun along the way. The primary function of our lungs is first and foremost to provide our body with oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. So why do we need oxygen, and where does the carbon dioxide come from? Metabolism is the chemical reaction in the body's cells that changes food into energy. Our bodies need this energy to do everything from moving to thinking to growing. We measure food energy in calories. When we burn calories, similar to the burning of other fuels like wood or gasoline, oxygen is consumed and carbon dioxide is produced. Lungs supply that life-sustaining oxygen that we need and remove the carbon dioxide waste product that we produce. Breathing is essentially composed of two actions: in with the good air, out with the bad air. But what is the good air and what is the bad air? What are they made of? The air that we breathe in from our atmosphere is composed mostly of nitrogen, oxygen, and argon. And in dry air, where won't have any water vapor, we would have 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 1% argon, and a trace of carbon dioxide. And although this trace of carbon dioxide doesn't seem like very much, we know from research on climate change that small increases in carbon dioxide make a big difference to our planet. However, air is not always dry. If we look at air with 40% relative humidity, 40% of relative humidity means that there's 40% of the maximum amount of water vapor that the air can hold at that temperature. So at 20 degrees Celsius, if it's 40% relative humidity, about 1% of the air we're breathing is water vapor, and that dilutes the other gas. Now, as soon as we inhale that air, two important things happen. One is that the air gets heated to our body temperature. So in this case, the room air that we breathed in at 20 degrees Celsius gets warmed up to 37 degrees Celsius. The other important change to the air that we breathe in occurs because the linings of our airways are moist. So as the inspired air travels through our airways, it becomes saturated with water vapor, so that by the time it reaches the alveoli at the end of the airways, it's at 37 degrees and 100% relative humidity. And under those conditions, about 6.6% of that air is now water vapor. So that dilutes the concentrations of the other gases. Nitrogen is down to 73%, oxygen's down to just over 19.5%. But when we breathe out, look what happened. The nitrogen is pretty much the same as the air we breathed in, but the oxygen now has dropped to about 15.4%. The argon is still about the same, close to 1%, but now the carbon dioxide, because we've been producing carbon dioxide, jumps up to over 4%, and the water vapor stays the same at 6.6%. So when we breathe out this moist, warm air, as soon as it gets into the room air, it cools. And when it cools, the water vapor condenses into droplets. And that's why if you huff on your glasses when you're trying to clean them, it fogs over, because the water vapor condenses into a fog that will fog up your glasses or fog up a mirror if you breathe on it. When we're outside in winter, pretty much all of the water vapor in the air we exhale condenses into a fog, and of course that's when we can see our breath. However, we are also carbon dioxide emitters. After the water vapor has condensed, about 5% of the remaining dry gas is carbon dioxide, and that's what we breathe out on each and every breath. Let's take a closer look at how lungs fit inside the body. Of course, here are the lungs, one on the left, one on the right, and nestled in between them is the heart, just a bit to the left side. And this muscle along the bottom of the lungs is the diaphragm, and of course that's the main muscle of breathing. And when the diaphragm contracts and pulls down, it draws air into the lung. And we'll see in a moment how that draws air into the lung. Below the diaphragm are the liver and the stomach. The kidneys are in behind, and we see the intestines and other internal organs. Here's a very simple model that shows how the lung works. I've got a balloon suspended inside the syringe and open to the air. Every time I pull back on the syringe, I draw air into the balloon. And as I release the syringe, the balloon contracts. That's due to the elasticity of the balloon contracting on its own. So inspiration is active and expiration is passive. How is our breathing regulated? The autonomic nervous system controls all automatic body functions, including breathing, but it also controls such functions as heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, and metabolism. But what sets our lungs apart is that we can override the autonomic control. We can consciously control our breathing. We can take a deep breath and blow out at will. We use our lungs to talk, to sing, to whistle, to play wind instruments, and to blow out candles. And we can also hold our breath to dive. But we can also return to cruise control. So how does the brain regulate breathing on cruise control? Well, in addition to the 5 senses that we usually think of, we have sensors that can detect light waves, we have sensors that detect sound waves, we have sensors that detect touch, we also have chemical sensors that detect things like taste and smell, but there are other sensors that we have inside our body as well. And one of these sensors is called the carotid body. And on each side of our neck, where the main arteries go up to the brain, there's a carotid body. And the carotid body can sense the composition of the arterial blood that's passing through it. And its main signals are the levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so the carotid body sends information to the brain, and the brain evaluates the amount of carbon dioxide and oxygen that's in the blood and adjusts the breathing accordingly. So it may decide that we have to breathe a little deeper or a little faster, or it may decide we can slow down. Now, who doesn't love a pop quiz? Oh boy. So here's the quiz. Which is larger, a regulation size softball or a common party balloon? And this is not a trick question. They're both drawn to exactly the same scale. Now remember your answer, because I'm going to come back to it in about a minute or so. My wife and I are Jeopardy fans. And in spite of what I'm about to show you, we still are fans. When I watch Jeopardy, I have a habit of shouting out answers at the television. And when this one came up, it's the largest internal organ in the human body, I said, the lung, it's the lung. Well, Matt was the first one to buzz in, and he phrased his response in the form of a question and said, what is the liver? And I said, meh, wrong. But Ken said, correct. And I thought, these are two smart guys. How can they both be wrong? So I did a bit of fact checking with Professor Google. So I asked Professor Google, what is the largest internal organ? And Professor Google said it was the liver. But if you examine Professor Google's response, only the weight of the liver is mentioned, not the size. So I rephrased the question and I asked Professor Google, what is the volume of the adult human liver? And Professor Google says it's about 1,500 cubic centimeters, which is equivalent to 1.5 liters. Then I asked Professor Google, what is the volume of adult human lungs? And Professor Google said they're about 6 liters. So which is larger, 1.5 liters or 6 liters? So that gets us back to the pop quiz, which is larger? Well, the volume of a typical party balloon is 3.8 liters, and the volume of a regulation softball is less than half a liter, which makes the balloon 8 times larger. So yes, if you had said the balloon, you're correct. It is larger. If you said the softball, yes, the softball is heavier, but it's not larger. That's the wrong answer. Now don't get me wrong, I've got nothing against the liver. Well, unless somebody tries to serve it to me for supper, obviously. But the lungs are bigger. So how big are our lungs anyway? Well, as we breathe in and out, our lungs expand and contract. When we measure the size of lungs, we measure the maximum amount of air that our lungs will hold. And this is called the total lung capacity. And we abbreviate that to TLC. Now, some of you may immediately say, well, TLC means tender loving care. But now you've got something else pleasant to think about that affects the size of our lungs. Because the taller you are, the bigger your lungs are. Your lungs fit inside your rib cage, and the taller you are, the bigger rib cage you have. The next thing that affects the size of our lungs is birth sex. Males have bigger lungs than females of the same age and height. Why is that? Well, the female of our species has evolved to accommodate childbirth. And that has resulted in females having a somewhat smaller rib cage in order to accommodate pregnancy. The next factor that affects the size of our lungs is our age. So lungs grow from childhood into adolescence and early adulthood, and then gradually start shrinking as we age. Even after we reach our maximum height, our lungs continue to grow, and in most cases, our maximum lung volume is reached between about 22 and 26 years old. So how does lung size vary across our lifetimes? Well, what I'm showing are examples of a female who's going to reach an adult height of 163 centimeters, which is the average height for a female here in Canada, and for a male that has an adult height of 178 meters, which is the average height for males. So at birth, our lungs are not very big at all. Our lung volume is typically about 145 milliliters. And so if you think of that smallest little milk carton that you could get, it's not even a full milk carton, which is 250 mils. Now here's a little bit of nickel knowledge. When you're first born, the largest internal organ is the brain. It's bigger than either the lungs or the liver. Now by the time we reach age 2, our lungs have already grown to be about 1 liter. And at age 7, they've grown enough to be about 2 liters. The boys are slightly bigger than the girls at this point, but by the time you get to age 13, when lung volumes reach about 4 liters for girls, the boys are already a half liter ahead. So in addition to this 4-liter jug, they've got another half liter. And at age 25, which is about where we reach the maximum lung volume, women max out at about 5 liters, and men max out at about 7 liters. Now, not to brag, well, maybe to brag a little bit, I'm 186 centimeters tall, and when I was 25, my lung volume was over 8 liters. So where does the air go when we're breathing? Sounds like a really simple question, but it's really worth taking a closer look. So to begin with, let's look at the air going through the nose. In fact, Mother Nature would prefer that we breathe through our nose, and I'll show you a bit more about that later on. Newborn babies are compulsive nose breathers. The only time they breathe through their mouths is when they cry, and that lasts for about the first 4 months of life. So as we breathe through our nose, the air goes up through the nasal cavity, around to the back of the throat, and down here into the top of the windpipe. This structure at the top of the windpipe is called the larynx, and that's where the voice box is. And then below it, as we'll see a little later on, is the trachea. So it looks pretty simple that the air comes around here and goes down in towards the lung. But you've already noticed that there's another tube in the throat, and of course this is the esophagus, which goes down into the stomach. So why is the air going down to the windpipe instead of the esophagus? Well, not shown in this diagram is something called the upper esophageal sphincter, and it's a ring of muscle around the esophagus that tightens and squeezes the esophagus shut to prevent the air from going down here to the stomach, because of course we don't want air in our stomach. It causes bloating and burping and discomfort, and this sphincter controls that. But what happens when we eat and we want things to go down our esophagus? Well, first of all, if we're going to be eating something, I highly recommend having something that's one of my favorite foods that is both nutritious and delicious. So when you take a bite of this donut and chew it up, you get all that wonderful flavor coming into your tongue. And then when you go to swallow it, it comes down and it goes down into the esophagus. And so the swallowing motion opens that sphincter at the top and the food goes down into the stomach. But what's to stop the food from going down into the lung? The larynx and the trachea are both very rigid structures. You can't collapse them with muscle. So there's another mechanism that the body uses. This structure here is called the epiglottis, and it works like a trap door. So when you're swallowing, this trap door swings shut and doesn't let the food go down into the lung. It all goes down into the stomach. But there's another mechanism as well that helps here. If we were to look down into the voice box, this is what we would see. There's a structure called the glottis. And of course this is in the voice box, so these are the vocal cords. These two white bands here are the vocal cords, and they're the ones that vibrate, and we can control the tone of the vibration through our muscles in the voice box, and that's what allows us to talk and sing and make all sorts of sounds. But the other thing we can do is close this right off with our muscles. And you can try that right now and see how that happens, because if you take in a big breath and hold it with your mouth open, you're going like that. And even though you keep your mouth open, and you can still push and go and no air comes out because your glottis is closed. And so that's another mechanism we can use to keep unwanted things from going into our lungs. So as I mentioned before, below the voice box or the larynx is the trachea. And so the trachea is the main airway going down into the lungs. And when it gets down to this level, it splits into the right and the left main stem bronchus to deliver air to the right lung and the left lung. And then that bronchus in turn splits into two others, and then it splits into two more and two more and two more all the way down. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. So here's our lungs, and if we could look beyond all the lung tissue, this is what we would see. In fact, this is a casting of the airways of the lung. And it's made by taking post-mortem lungs and injecting a vinyl resin into all of the airways, and when it sets, all of the lung tissue is stripped away, and this is what you would see. So as we get further out into the lungs, there's branching and branching and branching going on. Each division of branching is called a generation. And in some areas of the lung, there's about 18 generations to get to the end of the airways. In others, there's as much as 26 or even 28 generations to reach the end of the lungs. And of course, this type of branching is common in other parts of nature. In fact, if we look at a tree, we see the same sorts of things. There's the main trunk that branches off into two other branches, and those branch into other branches, and so on. And for this reason, the structure of the airways in the lung is often referred to as the bronchial tree. Now, when we get to the end of all of these branching airways, we get to where the action really happens, in the alveoli. At the ends of all of these airways that we have in the lung, there are clusters of alveoli known as alveolar sacs. But let's have a look at just one of the 500 million or so alveoli that we have in our lungs. Now, I think that this is the most important slide in my presentation. As I said at the outset, the primary purpose of the lung, first and foremost, is to get oxygen into the body and to get carbon dioxide out of the body. And this is how it happens. Now, this diagram is not to scale, and the features have been over-exaggerated in order for me to describe the processes that I'm about to show you. So firstly, this is the alveolus that we see in cross-section. So this is the wall of the alveolus, and here it's connected to the alveolar sac and out to the airways. This on the outside is a very small blood vessel that's called a pulmonary capillary. In the capillary, blood is flowing along in this direction. And what we see in the capillary are red blood cells. Now, red blood cells are really quite fascinating. I could talk for another hour just about them. But just to give you a synopsis, first of all, red blood cells are the largest number of cells we have in our body. 80% of the cells in our body are red blood cells, and that should tell you just how important they are. Now, red blood cells are essentially a big sack of hemoglobin molecules. And when those hemoglobin molecules bind with oxygen, they turn a nice bright red. And in fact, it's these red blood cells, of course, that give our blood its color. If you remove the red blood cells from a sample of blood, you'd be left with a straw-colored fluid, similar to the color we see here. Now, on the other hand, when the oxygen is depleted from the red blood cells, they turn a dark burgundy or almost blue. And the veins that we can see through our skin look blue because of that. We're seeing the depleted red blood cells flowing back to the heart. The process of getting oxygen into the bloodstream and carbon dioxide back into the alveoli is known as gas exchange. And what drives this gas exchange? The movement of these molecules is through a process of diffusion. The oxygen molecules have to diffuse across the walls of the alveoli and the capillary to get into the bloodstream. But what drives them to do that? As we saw before, the concentration of oxygen in the inspired air is around 18 or 19%, and so the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli will be about 19% of atmospheric pressure. And the partial pressure of oxygen on the blood side is very low. So it's that difference in pressure that becomes the driving force to push oxygen from the air into the blood. Now, oxygen is not very soluble, but it still is able to dissolve into the membrane cells that make up the wall of the alveoli, and they diffuse across into the capillary. And once they're in the plasma, they're very quickly picked up by the hemoglobin, and they're bound in the hemoglobin molecules. And there are about 250 million hemoglobin molecules in each red blood cell. Now, oxygen is not very soluble, so pretty much all of the oxygen that's carried out of the lung is carried in red blood cells and transported throughout the body. Now, carbon dioxide, on the other hand, is quite soluble. So some of the carbon dioxide transport occurs from carbon dioxide being dissolved in the plasma, in addition to the carbon dioxide that's carried by the hemoglobin molecules. And again, because carbon dioxide is more soluble, it's easier for the carbon dioxide to diffuse across the membranes and back into the air. But once again, it's the partial pressure difference that's driving the carbon dioxide from the blood to the air, because the carbon dioxide concentrations are high on this side. And as we saw before, there's only a trace of carbon dioxide in the air we breathe in. So that's pushing the carbon dioxide into the alveolus. And then we breathe out the carbon dioxide here. So lungs are not just about airflow, they're also about blood flow. So here's another diagram that's really exaggerated, but this time in order to help understand how the blood flow works. If you look at a regular chest x-ray, you would see that the lungs are much closer together, and you would also see that the heart is just nestled in between the lungs. So in this diagram, the heart is about 4 or 5 times bigger than it should be. Similar to the previous diagrams that we've had, we use red for oxygenated blood and blue for blood in which the oxygen has been depleted. Once the blood flows through the body and unloads the oxygen, it all collects and comes back to the vena cava and ends up in the right side of the heart, or the right ventricle. When the heart pumps, all of the blood from the right ventricle goes to the lungs. It goes through the lungs where we have the gas exchange, and then it turns this nice red color because it's oxygenated, and goes back to the heart and into the left side. And when the heart beats, the blood from the left side of the heart goes to all other regions of the body. So I showed you before this cast of the airways of the lung, but there's also a huge network of blood vessels in the lung. And once again, the blood vessels get smaller and smaller to turn into pulmonary capillaries, which are too small to be shown in a diagram like this, but it gives you the sense of the overlapping network of airways and blood vessels. So here's another diagram, and this one is meant to give you a sense of perspective of just how big, or rather how small, the alveoli are. When an alveolus is full, it has a diameter of about 250 microns. That's less than 1/4 of a millimeter. And for comparison, this is what 3 sheets of paper would look like. So when the alveolus is full, it has about the same diameter as 3 sheets of paper. The membrane which forms the wall of the alveolus is only 1.5 microns thick. And remember, a micron is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. The red blood cells are about 7 microns in diameter, and some of the pulmonary capillaries are about the same diameter as the red blood cell, so there's just enough room for it to get through. Now, if you were to look at a cross-section of a lung that's been cut in half, it looks like a sponge, and you might think you're looking at alveoli, but you're not. The holes you can see with the naked eye are airways and blood vessels. We need a microscope to really see all of the alveoli. So what we're seeing here are the alveoli, and now you can see that they're not nice little round spheres like I've been showing you. They're a hodgepodge of different shapes and different sizes. So the number of alveoli depends on your age and your lung size. In adult human lungs, the average number of alveoli is about 480 million, with a range of anywhere from 274 to 790 million alveoli. Why do we need hundreds of millions of alveoli? Well, remember, oxygen needs to be able to diffuse across a very thin membrane to go from air to the blood. Similarly, carbon dioxide needs to cross the membrane from the blood to the air. And so millions of alveoli are needed in order to provide a sufficiently fine membrane with a sufficiently large surface area. The lungs are our interface between the air and the blood. So how big is that interface? And what is the surface area of the lung that is exposed to air? What you may have seen on some websites and even in some medical journals is that the total surface area of our lungs is roughly the same size as a tennis court. That's wrong. It's not that big. A single tennis court is about 200 square meters in area. And the current estimates of our alveolar surface area for an average adult is 50 to 70 square meters. That's still pretty big, especially when you compare it to, for example, the surface area of our skin, which is about 2 square meters. So if you want an analogy, here in Saskatchewan, we're not really a tennis province. We're a football province. In fact, if you were to look at a single tennis court and how it would fit on a football field, it's about from the goal line to the 10-yard line and from the sidelines out to the hash marks. And of course, the lung surface area isn't quite that big. It's actually closer to the 70 square meters, and that would reach from about the goal line to the 5-yard line and from the sidelines to about 3/4 of the way to the hash marks. For those of you who aren't from Saskatchewan, there's a couple of things I need to point out. Yes, that is a gopher standing on the sidelines watching the game. And yes, we won that game. Our lungs are our greatest exposure to the air and therefore to the environment around us. And the air that's all around us will contain things like smoke and dust, toxins, allergens, viruses, mold, bacteria, and germs. So the question arises, how do we keep our lungs clean when we're exposed to all these things in the air? So our first line of defense is the nose. And as I mentioned before, Mother Nature wants us to breathe through the nose. And one of the reasons for this is that the nose acts like a filter. There are hairs on the inside of our nose, but there's also a lining of mucus. And as we breathe in, some of the pollutants that we don't want to get into our lungs get stuck on the mucus, and they get trapped and they never do make it into the lungs. Now I've drawn mucus as green here because we're used to thinking of it that way. But generally, mucus is clear and watery. And it's usually only when we have some kind of infection that it becomes thick and green. And then it's more affectionately known as snot. And of course, snot is right up there with pee and poo as some of the secretions that we put out of our body that we would rather not have contact with, and for good reason, once they're out of our bodies. But all three of those, of course, perform a very important function in getting toxins out of our body. A lot of the pollutants make it past the nose. What happens then? I mentioned before that the linings of our airways are moist, and that's why we lose water every time we breathe. But one of the reasons that they're moist is that there is also a mucus layer on the inside of the airways. And this mucus layer floats over these hair-like cells that are called cilia. And the cilia beat and make the mucus move. So this movement of the cilia propels the mucus up towards the mouth. And any particles that come in and get stuck on the mucus get carried out towards the mouth. The airways are lined with little goblet cells that make a substance called mucin. And the mucin mixes with the water to make mucus. And once again, mucus is usually clear and watery and moves along quite nicely. So what happens when the mucus that's being pushed up out of the airways reaches the top of the lung? So the mucus comes up the airway and into the back of the throat and then finds its way down the esophagus, and we swallow it without even knowing. Of course, when we have an infection or there's more smoke or other particulate matter, sometimes we have to help that mucus along, and we do that by coughing. But another mechanism, again, that we do just as a reflex is that when the mucus starts to build up, we might clear our throat. And sometimes when we clear our throat, we get a bit of mucus building up that we do notice. And at that point, we call it phlegm. And we might swallow it or we might cough it out. And if we cough it out, then it mixes a bit with our saliva and we call it sputum. So where does the word phlegm come from? Now, some very clever folks out there might be thinking, oh, I know, that looks like onomatopoeia. The word phlegm is based on the sound you make when you're clearing your throat, kind of a phlegm, but you'd be wrong. Phlegm is a word that the ancient Greeks used to describe the mucus that we usually cough up. And they regarded phlegm as one of the body's humors. In ancient Greek medicine, phlegm was associated with lethargy. But what happens down in the alveoli? Remember, we have got this really fine membrane where we have to get the gas exchange happening. We can't afford to have any mucus down here. That would make it just too hard for the oxygen to go across. So we have another mechanism. We have little cells called alveolar macrophages. And these little alveolar macrophage cells wander around in the alveolus, identifying and destroying particulate matter and pathogens. And so just like a little vacuum cleaner that wanders around, it goes and picks up these particles. It actually digests some of them. And when it gets full, it finds its way out to the airway and gets onto this floating mucus, which is sometimes referred to as the mucus escalator, and it's carried again out of the lung. The lung works very hard to keep itself clean, but sometimes it can be overloaded with pollutants. This is a representation of a healthy airway, and the things to note here is that the airway is nice and wide open, which makes it easy for the air to flow through, and the mucus layer lining the airway is nice and thin. However, when we continually breathe air that's high in pollutants, we overload the cleaning system. And when that occurs, two things happen. First of all, the lung airway becomes inflamed, and that makes the diameter of the airway smaller, which makes it a lot harder for the air to go in and out. And secondly, the airways produce a whole lot more mucus, and the mucus layer grows, which further restricts the flow. But on top of that, the mucus is thicker and stickier and harder for the cilia to move. And in some cases, it can get even worse because the mucus can actually form a plug that blocks the whole airway and doesn't allow any airflow at all. Now, when this thicker mucus finally gets up to the top of the airway, it needs help to get it out. And so we have to cough to move that mucus up out of the airway. And that, of course, produces mucus in our throats. And this condition of having airways that are obstructed by this inflammation and a thick mucus layer is called chronic bronchitis. And the main symptom for chronic bronchitis is a cough productive of sputum on most days for at least 3 months of the year. Now, what happens when these pollutants get down into the alveolus? And the pollutants that can actually get down into the alveoli are called fine and ultrafine particles. One of the factors that makes up the air quality index is the amount of fine and ultrafine particles in the air. And you'll see them listed as PM10, which stands for particulate matter of 10 microns in diameter, and also PM 2.5, which is particulate matter of 2.5 microns in diameter. And these are the really fine particles that you can't see in the air, but when they get down into your alveoli, they can cause trouble. So if there's continual exposure to these fine and ultrafine particles, either through smoking, which is the most common reason, or also through occupational exposures in areas where there are high levels of fine and ultrafine dust, then the lung needs to do something about it. And one of the things that happens is that a lot more of these alveolar macrophage cells, these little vacuums that are picking up particles, are generated. And they get to work trying to manage the increased load of particles coming in. But when there's so many of them and so many particles, they start to break down. And when they break down, they release toxins that instead of targeting the particulates, start attacking the walls of the alveoli themselves. And when this happens, we get a condition called emphysema. So this is the graphic sketch of healthy alveoli, and so this is a healthy cluster of alveoli, and this is what happens with emphysema. The walls of the alveoli are eaten away. And this can happen to large sections of the lung, and when this happens, of course, there's no more gas exchange happening in these spaces where the alveolar walls used to be. We've lost that crucial surface area that's necessary for getting the oxygen we need. And not only that, but because we've lost the walls of the alveoli, we also lose some of the elastic structure of the lung, and that makes it a lot harder to breathe. COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, is an umbrella term that includes both chronic bronchitis and emphysema. They can occur together or they can occur separately. COPD is the second leading cause of hospital admissions in Canada, and only childbirth is higher. And COPD is the fourth leading cause of death in Canada. So your lungs do so much for you. Here's something you can do for them. The most important thing is don't smoke or vape. Keep your vaccinations against viral infections current. Because remember that one of the main entry points for viruses into the body is through the lungs. Avoid smoke and dust when you can, but use masks in a dusty or smoky environments or when exposed to people with respiratory infections. And do your part to protect the environment and reduce air pollution. Now here's something else you can do for your lungs. It's quick and easy, and your lungs will thank you for it. When I'm just standing here or sitting at rest, I'm only breathing in and out about half a liter in each breath. But if I breathe all the way up to the top and breathe all the way out to the bottom, I can breathe 5 liters in and out. That's 10 times as much. So a lot of my lungs are being kept in reserve because when I'm just sitting at rest or just standing, I don't have much of an oxygen demand. But if I were to start carrying around something really heavy, or if I had to run away from a really scary beast, I would need all the oxygen I could get. And my lungs would be breathing in almost 5 liters in and out every time. and delivering all the oxygen they could. But when we're just sitting at rest, like you might be now just watching this presentation, you're not using very much of your lungs. And the part that doesn't get used can get stiff. The air you breathe in is not really going much to the top of the lungs when you're at rest, and the alveoli themselves can even close right off. And the blood flow gets redirected to other parts of the lung, and the lung gets stiff. And like when your muscles get stiff, it's good to have that stretch to relieve that stiffness. Well, it's the same thing with your lungs. Your lungs need to stretch to get rid of that stiffness and restore themselves. And so what you can do for your lungs is take a nice big breath in, just right up the top as much as you can, and then breathe out nice and slowly. And what that does is to reset the elasticity of your lungs, which makes it easier to breathe. The blood that was just sitting around and not really engaged in gas exchange at the top of the lungs is now flushed through, and you've reset the whole system, and your lungs are working more efficiently. But it's not just your lungs that thank you for that, it's your brain. A deep breath has a calming effect on the brain. And that's one of the reasons whenever we're feeling anxious or angry, we're told, take a deep breath. And taking that deep breath is good for both the lungs and the brain. Now, another involuntary action that the lungs can do if you don't take that big breath for them is a sigh. Periodically, without you perhaps even noticing, you'll take a little bit deeper breath than normal and breathe out a little bit more than normal. It's not quite a full breath, but it still helps. It's a bit of a stretch. In fact, in people who are receiving mechanical ventilation, where there's a ventilator doing the breathing for them, a sigh is programmed into it. So every so often, there's a sigh that's built in to help again to reset and maintain the integrity and the elasticity. But there's one more involuntary action that involves a deep breath, and that's a yawn. I've never seen one definitive piece of research that tells us all the reasons we yawn. One of the reasons that we think of most frequently is that we're tired or that we're bored. But yawning is also contagious. When we see someone else yawning, that can trigger us to yawn as well. And that's probably more of a social response. We're feeling empathy for the person who's yawning, and we join them in that yawning exercises. But on the other hand, even a fetus in the womb will yawn. And several animals besides humans yawn. So yawning is very common. But paradoxically, yawning in public is considered rude in most cultures. And that may be because it's a sign that you're getting tired or bored with the people around you. However, you're likely watching this video in the comfort of your own home and nobody's around. And so if I've been boring you with my presentation and you feel a yawn coming on, go for it. Go along with it. Get that big stretch in. You'll feel better, and so will your lungs. Now, if all has gone according to plan, I think there's lots of time left over for me to take your questions remotely, and hopefully I can give you some good answers. However, if you're watching this video from the Lung Association website at some time in the future, and you have questions, please send your questions to info@lungsask.ca. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, well, I'm not yawning because I was bored, Dr. Graham. I'm yawning because I'm showing love to my lungs, and I did not know that that was good for me. So now, when if anyone catches me yawning in a work meeting, I can just say I'm showing love to my lungs. Thank you so much for that presentation. I learned so much. I'm sure everyone that tuned in learned a lot. I can honestly say that this is the first time in the Lung Life webinar series that we had Gainer the gopher, make an appearance. So thank you for that. And I too would have got the Jeopardy question wrong. I never ever would have shouted out the liver. So thank you. And thank you for joining us tonight, all the way from Costa Rica. It's a little bit warmer where you are compared to where we are in Saskatchewan. And I also want to give a big shout out and warm welcome to your friends in Costa Rica that are tuning in tonight as well. It's wonderful to have them. A reminder that Dr. Graham's presentation has been recorded, and later on it will be posted on our website, lungsas.ca. And we've got some questions here. We do have some time to chat with Dr. Graham. And if you haven't asked your question, go ahead and put it in the chat feature. Okay, so you ready to take some questions, Dr. Graham?
Sure. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. And is it warmer where you are? I have to ask.
Well, I think I should have had my thermometer here to show you, but we're still well above 30 degrees.
That's amazing. Us here too, just with a minus in front of it. Awesome. And thanks for taking the time to tune in all the way from Costa Rica. Okay, with that, we actually have a question just as you talked about the temperature. Is it easier to breathe warm, moist air versus cold, dry air, like when we're like here in Saskatchewan?
So the uh, being whether it's easier to breathe is probably not the same question as uh, what happens in your lungs when you're breathing cold air versus breathing warm air. Because the often when we think of ease of breathing, it's how much effort does it take to get that air in and out, and that's not going to change much. But on the other hand, uh, the having to put a lot of energy into the cold air to bring it up to room temperature can be a problem. And in fact, in some people with asthma, the cold air itself is a trigger for asthma because you're having to add all that extra water in because cold air is dry. As soon as the temperature drops below zero, there's practically no water vapor at all left in the air. Even at 100% relative humidity, there's very little. And so that requirement itself can be a trigger for bronchospasm and so on, just breathing in that cold air.
Okay, so thank you. So with that, just to follow up with that, if cold air is a trigger for someone with asthma, is there something that they can do to help protect their airways if they have to go out in the cold?
Well, the first answer is don't go out in the cold. The second one is, especially if you're exercising, try and do indoor exercise rather than outdoor exercise. But when you are outside or just walking, it's good to have like an asthma mask or a filter or a scarf or something over your mouth and nose so that you don't you get some heating and cooling that's happening through the mask or through the scarf, and you protect yourself from that. It's often a good idea to try to breathe in those situations, breathe in through your nose and breathe out through your mouth.
Perfect. Yeah, and you talked about that in your presentation, why Mother Nature prefers us to breathe through our nose and how, as opposed to
Yeah.
mouth breathing. So thank you for that. Okay, there's another question that's related here that just came in. So some people are wondering why they feel like it's more challenging for them to breathe in hot, humid environments.
Yes, yes. And so a lot of that is just from the discomfort of being, having the high humidity and the heat. And so the problem there, of course, is that uh, the body itself, and in addition to the lungs are used to having air at 37 degrees because that's where they keep it. But the breathing in cool air acts as a natural coolant to the body, but breathing in the hot air makes it harder for the body to be cool, and especially if you get temperatures that are higher. I'm just going to see if this will work here. If I can bring this in, so can you see
Oh,
the
now he's just showing off.
so at this temperature, we're not bad, but as soon as you start getting up into the high 30s, then you get the stress of trying to cool your body from the heat. And people have different responses to the heat and different levels of tolerance for higher heat.
Okay. Okay, so we need to find that happy perfect medium, perfect temperature for some of us. Not too hot, not too cold. Hey, just like Goldilocks.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for answering that. Um, Earlier, you were using an example of talking about, how much air people can blow out, and you had the milk cartons, and I really, really appreciated that. And you talked about the differences between men and women, and height had a factor as well. But you specifically gave an example that on average, men will kind of max out at that 7 liters. But you mentioned that in your 20s, you could actually blow out over like around 8 liters. And so there's some questions around how did you do that? And is there something that we can all do so we can do that
So
too?
yeah, well, the thing is, it's height that makes the difference. I mean, height is the biggest factor, and so the taller you are, the bigger your lungs will be. And so my lung volume was typical for anyone of my height.
Okay.
So that's the part that's there. But there are people who who can expand their lung volumes, and it's typically people who are involved with playing wind instruments or opera singers. They're probably the two most common areas where people will develop bigger lung volumes and have can substantially bigger lung volumes because they're using all of their lungs all of the time, and they're taking great big breaths in and out, and so they're continually stretching and trying to use their max lung volumes.
Okay, that makes good sense, and maybe something that we don't often think about. I can honestly say I don't know many opera singers, but that maybe we should all start practicing. Hey, that's awesome. Okay, there's a really good question here. Some people are wondering, can you live normally with only one lung, or if you have a surgery and have maybe part of your lung removed?
So yes, so our lungs are over designed, if you will, in that we don't need to use our full lungs all the time. I mean, it's really just when we do our peak and max exercise. And so yes, at sitting at rest, we're using just a small part of our lungs. And uh, so if you have for example, one lung removed, or if you have some kind of an injury, for example, where one of your lungs gets collapsed, and that usually can be from like a puncture of the rib cage or something, the you would still be able to function at a rest level, but where you would begin to notice the problem, of course, is when you put a higher demand on your body for more oxygen. And so if you were, you had to do some hard exercise or some heavy lifting or some, those sorts of things, that's when you would find that limitation. So yes, you can still live, but you would have limitations at the level of exercise that you could perform.
Okay, okay. Thank you for that. And so on to with the discussion of exercise, you'd given us some really great tips talking about breathing in deeply, yawning, making sure that we're, allowing the lungs to stretch, that sort of thing. It's also good for our brain to take a big breath in, and it can calm us down as well. Is there research saying that exercise in general is good for specifically for our lungs?
I think that once again, it's all part of the keeping your body healthy and active is it's an all integrated part of it, because really, your lungs have to work in harmony with the heart, and of course there's so many other things that that are in that one has to consider along with that. And so just your body shape, I mean, it can be more difficult for to breathe if you have, say, a lot of body fat around your tummy. Then it can be more difficult for your lungs to expand in and out completely. Uh, the blood has to be um, able to carry all of the oxygen that's there. So if people are anemic or have low hemoglobin levels, then the lungs can be working nicely, but you're still not getting the oxygen you need. And so all of those things can come into play. But the thing is that when you get into better and better shape, you become more efficient at how you can do this too. And another thing that affects for how much you can breathe and how fast you can breathe is also the musculature around your chest, because you have muscles between your ribs and you have general muscles throughout your chest that you use in addition to the diaphragm for getting the air in and out. Another thing to consider is just how you breathe. And breathing with your diaphragm is what's generally preferred. And when you do diaphragmatic breathing, and I don't know, Jill, if you have links to that that's up on the website, but that's something else to consider. Is just how you breathe and the posture you have when you're breathing. All of those things can come into play.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. One of our Saskatchewan respiratory therapist, Donna Turner, did a presentation that's on our website about the importance of breathing deeply and using the diaphragm. So, with that, there's another question. An individual that unfortunately was recently in hospital with pneumonia, and they had them use um, a breathing device that encouraged them to breathe deeply. Um, is that something that did they do that for these similar reasons, or was there a different reason why they had them do that? They weren't really sure.
Well, yeah, I think that with pneumonia, it's usually more of a lower respiratory tract thing. And again, it's uh, when we breathe normally, we're not using all of our lungs. We're not getting the same clearance through all of our lungs, and we help those the clearance of mucus and other things from our lungs by the way we breathe. And for example, getting back to your question about heat, but probably more so humidity, we don't want to dry out the mucus and so on, and having the moisture that's there. And that's why sometimes having in very dry climates like Saskatchewan, sometimes having that humidifier so that you humidify some of the gas, and then that helps keep the mucus more fluid and easier to clear things out.
Okay. Yeah, that makes good sense. Thank you for that. That's a great explanation. There's a question here about people living with COPD and asthma. COPD stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It's an obstructive lung disease. Asthma a little different, but it also can obstruct the airway. Um, for those individuals, when they breathe, do they have and when you analyze their blood and types of things. There's questions about if they have higher CO2 levels in the blood.
Yes, there can be that is uh, that is a situation that happens. So that if we're not getting full gas exchange, and this can particularly happen with emphysema, where we've lost the ability to transfer gas back and forth to the bloodstream, because there's been a loss of that surface area from the areas from the emphysema. It's like we have big holes. We've taken big parts of our lung out of the circulation, then you're not able to get all the carbon dioxide out, and you will retain carbon dioxide. You'll look cyanotic. I mean, you if you look under your eyelids, you might be a little blue, or sometimes under your fingernails, you'd see they look a little blue, and of course that's because the red blood cells aren't as fully oxygenated, and you see that there's more carbon dioxide around, and you would see that blueness happen. So that is one of the results of having uh, a loss of gas transfer and gas exchange capability within the lung.
Okay, okay, thank you. Um, there's some questions I know you talked about earlier, how the lungs work very hard for you and how they try and clean out some of the things that we breathe in that our body doesn't want to breathe in. There's a question about, can the lungs actually repair a little bit and regenerate?
Sure. Well, yes, the lung does have some repair mechanisms, and there is that ability to do limited repair if you want. And the lung has also other defense mechanisms that can help limit damage as well. So, yeah, we took the example, or what I showed was the example when you have a lot of exposure. The alveolar macrophage cells can break down, and that's what can dissolve some of the airways of the lung. And that's because the alveolar macrophage cells have a digestive enzyme called trypsin, and when that gets released, it gets uh, into the alveoli. But fortunately, the liver and the lungs are good friends, and the liver sends a protein called antitrypsin to the blood, to the lung, and that antitrypsin can prevent the, uh, the enzyme leakage from the macrophage cells from damaging the lung. And so there's that sort of aspect to it as well. So yes, some of the damage that can be done can be irreversible, but there are other things that can happen where the lung does have some limited repair capabilities.
Okay. And yeah, I'm learning all kinds of things about the liver tonight between the Jeopardy question and who would have thought, hey?
Yeah.
That's thank you. There's also a question about air quality. You referred to the Air Quality Health Index, and one of the things that you can do to prevent, and to prevent harm and to show love to your lungs, you talked about, protecting yourself from poor air quality, right, and breathing in fresh, clean air. In Saskatchewan, the last numbers of years, we've seen higher air quality health index numbers, more days of that, a lot of wildfire smoke. With that, is there any research that shows that, having an air purifier in any way can help protect us as well?
So uh, the role of air purifiers is uh, I'm just trying to think about how to phrase this. In some cases, they can be very useful, but the more important thing is to have a proper evaluation of the air quality within your home or within your office or wherever the problem might be, and to really, first of all, determine whether there is a problem with the air quality, and second, if there is, what is the problem, and can it be remediated? If it can't, then an air purifier can help. But one has to be careful that you've got a good quality air purifier. But for example, if the problem arises because of exposure to tobacco smoke in the home, the air purifier is going to be swamped by it. And of course the much more preferred fix is really to remove the source of the pollution when possible. And if you can't, then there are other situations. Now, the other thing about when selecting air purifiers, it's important to uh, know the size of the room that you're going to be using it in and the amount of air that the purifier can clean. So that to be effective, that has to match. You have to have an air purifier that's going to be able to handle all of the air or, to handle that size of a room. So that's another important part of it. And so, for another example is pets. And so some people will say, well, yes, I've got a dog or a cat, and I've got this allergy, but I think if I use an air purifier, it's going to fix it. Well, it might help, but it might not fix it.
Okay, so eliminating the source whenever possible is definitely key. Knowing, yeah, if what
That's,
the size of the area you're trying to filter, all those things come into play. And
yes, and also ensuring that the mechanism of action of the air purifier. So it's either a HEPA filter, which is high efficiency particulate filter, and yeah, and activated charcoal, for example, is another type. There used to be a lot of ozone producing air purifiers, which are certainly not
right.
recommended, and so that's something to avoid.
Okay. Okay, great. Great practical tips. And thank you for that. And I think a little bit of that buyer beware too. Some of them claim to do a lot of things that maybe they don't in fact do. Okay. I think there's quite a few people that have been looking at Professor Google and looking you up a little bit, Dr. Graham. They seem to know that you are an expert in pulmonary function testing and have done a lot of research in that area. So we have some pulmonary function testing questions. The first one is just, should everyone have a pulmonary function test at a certain age?
There are certainly those who promote that, and one of the reasons being that if everybody at as they turn 20 years old gets a lung function test, then you would have a better track to be able to say if you see the level of pulmonary function decreasing over time, then you've got something that's a much better touchstone to go back to. So you can definitely say there is a difference. Uh, the, this, the Some of the other aspects, though, I mean, that currently is not a recommended procedure. It would be, I think, rather impractical, obviously, to have that done right now. Uh, the other aspects of it is that the reasons that you would do pulmonary function testing are usually to diagnose a disorder. And so the main use of getting a pulmonary function test is to assist with the diagnosis, and then to follow the patient to see if the treatment that's being given is working effectively, or whether it has to be tweaked up or tweaked down. And that's probably the most common thing that people run into as far as the effectiveness of pulmonary function testing. The other area where pulmonary function testing in a prospective manner, so starting at one point and then following it through, occurs in occupational health, where you do surveillance testing on a regular basis for people who are in dusty or dangerous air quality occupations. So people like firefighters, and especially people working with wildfires and forest fires, but also people working in uh, mining and hard rock, silicon
Right.
industries, and so on, where there's a lot of dust and dirt. Then there is a yearly, or sometimes twice yearly, or sorry, every 2 years, testing of spirometry, just to make sure that that person is not suddenly losing lung function at a much higher rate than they should.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I know, Dr. Graham, we could keep you here all night and ask you so many questions. You're such a wealth of knowledge for us. We so appreciate you joining us all the way from Costa Rica. Thank you so much. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have. And I also want to thank our sponsor tonight, GSK, and also everyone that tuned in tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your time, and I hope everyone will take care by taking a big breath in and maybe even a yawn every now and then. So thank you, and thank you, Dr.
Okay.
Graham.
All right. So long.